In the sleepy town of Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, where the hills rolled green and the air smelled of fresh-baked bread from Harrington Foods Factory, the big house on Maple Street stood like a silent king. Its windows gleamed under the morning sun, but inside it felt cold, like a place where laughter went to die. Grace Thompson, 32, a black woman with sharp eyes and a smile she kept tucked away like a secret, was wiping down the walnut bookshelves in the Harringtons' living room. Her hands moved steady, but her mind was elsewhere, back to a time when she was 18, standing in front of that same factory, clutching a business plan she'd poured her heart into. That dream crashed and burned when her mama, Ruth, died under circumstances nobody in this town liked to talk about. Now Grace was just the maid, invisible to most, scraping by to keep the lights on in her tiny apartment. I always thought a job like this would be quiet, simple, dust the shelves, mop the floors, keep my head down. But that morning, everything changed in a heartbeat. Elliot Harrington, the 38-year-old CEO of Harrington Foods, stormed into the room, his face tight with something between anger and exhaustion. His daughter, Sophie, 4 years old and all big eyes and curls, had been crying upstairs for hours. I'd spent the night on the hardwood floor next to her crib, singing old lullabies my mama used to hum, until Sophie finally drifted off, her little hand curled around my finger. I didn't expect Elliot to walk in right then, catching me sprawled out on the floor, my uniform wrinkled, my hair a mess. "What the hell are you doing?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet like a whip. "A lowlife like you has no business touching my daughter." He yanked Sophie out of the crib, waking her up. Her cries pierced the air, her tiny arms reaching for me. "She only sleeps when I'm close," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my chest felt like it was caving in. "Get out," he barked, pointing to the door. "You're the help, not her mother. Don't ever forget that." I stood there, feeling his words like a slap across the face. Lowlife. The words stung, sharp and bitter, like salt in an open wound. But I didn't flinch. I just nodded, picked up my rag, and walked out, my steps slow and deliberate. Inside, though, I was burning. I'd heard worse in my life, but something about the way Elliot looked at me, like I was nothing, made me clutch the locket in my pocket, the one Mama gave me before she passed. It had a photo of her standing in front of the Harrington factory, next to a man who looked a lot like Elliot's granddaddy. That picture was my secret, my tether to a truth this town had buried long ago. Later that day, I was sent to the Harrington Foods office to drop off some files. The place was all glass and steel, a shrine to money and power. Travis Boone, the CFO, strutted around like he owned the world. When he saw me, his lip curled into a smirk. "Don't go snooping around the important stuff, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the whole office to hear. A few people snickered, their eyes sliding over me like I was a smudge on the window. "Stick to cleaning," he added, tossing a pen at me like I was a dog fetching a bone. I caught it midair, set it down on his desk, and looked him dead in the eye. "I know my place, Mr. Boone," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to make his smirk falter for a split second. Maggie Cole, the longtime housekeeper who'd seen me through my first weeks at the Harringtons, caught my eye from the corner. She gave me a nod, like she knew I was holding something back, something big.
At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute. Maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. What nobody in that room knew was that I wasn't just some maid who stumbled into this job. I'd been at Harrington Foods before, a lifetime ago, as an intern with stars in my eyes and a plan to revolutionize their product line. That plan got me noticed, too noticed. It was stolen, and I was pushed out, right after Mama's death was swept under the rug as a tragic accident. I kept that truth locked tight, but every time I dusted those shelves or walked past that factory, I felt it stirring, like a storm waiting to break. I thought I could keep it buried, stay invisible, just do my job. But what I didn't expect was Sophie's little hand in mine, or the way Maggie whispered, "You're more than they think, Grace." And I sure as hell didn't expect that Elliot Harrington, of all people, would be the one to crack open the door to everything I'd been running from. Grace Thompson moved through the Harringtons' big house on Maple Street like a shadow, her footsteps soft against the polished floors, but her heart heavy with a fire she kept buried deep. After Elliot's outburst, calling her a lowlife and yanking Sophie from her arms, she'd gone back to her work, dusting, mopping, folding laundry, because that's what you do when the world tells you you're nothing. You keep going. But every night, when the house went quiet, Grace sat by Sophie's crib, humming an old gospel tune her mama, Ruth, used to sing in their tiny kitchen, back when life felt like it had a little more hope. Sophie, with her big brown eyes and curls that caught the moonlight, would reach through the crib bars, her tiny fingers wrapping around Grace's. "You're my star, Gracie," she'd whisper, her voice so small it could break your heart. Those moments were Grace's anchor, the only thing keeping her from walking away from Willow Creek and never looking back. She'd always thought she could just keep her head down, do her job, and stay out of trouble. But trouble, it seemed, had a way of finding her. In the mornings, Grace faced the cold glares of Elliot, who barely acknowledged her existence unless it was to bark an order, and the smug taunts of Travis Boone at the Harrington Foods office where she sometimes ran errands. Travis was the kind of man who wore his privilege like a tailored suit, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't get any ideas above your station," he'd said one day, tossing a stack of papers at her like she was a kid playing fetch. The office staff snickered, their eyes sliding over her like she was part of the furniture. Grace just nodded, her face a mask of calm, but inside she was memorizing every word, every look. She knew men like Travis, men who thought power was something you could hold over people's heads like a guillotine. But what he didn't know was that Grace had been in that office before, a decade ago, when she was an intern with a plan to change the world. That plan was stolen, and her mama's death was swept under the rug like dust. Those memories burned in her chest, but she kept them locked tight, waiting for the right moment. One evening, while cleaning the Harringtons' basement, a damp, cluttered space filled with forgotten boxes, Grace stumbled on a locked metal case tucked behind a stack of old recipe binders. Her hands trembled as she pried it open, using a trick she'd learned from her mama, who'd always said, "Locks only keep out the honest." Inside were papers, contracts stamped with Harrington Foods logo, but the numbers didn't add up. Fake invoices, hidden payouts, and a report about a factory accident from years ago, labeled "closed case." Grace's breath caught when she saw her mama's name, Ruth Thompson. The report claimed Ruth's death was a suicide, but Grace knew better. Her mama had been working overtime at the factory, pushing for better safety standards, when a faulty machine took her life. The company buried it, and Grace, just 18, was left with nothing but a locket and a broken heart. She snapped photos of the documents with her phone, her hand steady even as her pulse raced. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her mama, about Sophie, about every person this company had chewed up and spit out. The next day, Travis caught her leaving the basement, his eyes narrowing like a snake's. "What were you doing down there?" he demanded, stepping so close she could smell his overpriced cologne. "You think you're clever, don't you, poking around where you don't belong?" His voice was low, threatening, like a storm cloud about to burst. Grace met his gaze, her heart pounding, but her face cool as stone. "Just cleaning, Mr. Bone," she said, her voice even, but there was an edge to it, sharp enough to make him pause. "You'd do well to remember your place," he hissed, grabbing her arm. Grace didn't flinch. She pulled free, slow and deliberate, and said, "I know exactly where I belong." Travis's face twisted, but he let her go, his smirk faltering like he'd seen something in her eyes he didn't expect. Maggie Cole, the housekeeper who'd been with the Harringtons longer than Grace had been alive, saw the whole thing from the hallway. Later, when they were alone in the kitchen, Maggie poured Grace a cup of coffee and said, "You've got a fire in you, girl. Don't let them snuff it out." Grace managed a small smile, but her mind was racing. She didn't expect Maggie's kindness, didn't expect anyone in this house to see her as more than the help. Then there was Leila Monroe, the young admin at the office, who'd started noticing Grace's knack for spotting errors in paperwork. "You're wasted on mopping floors," Leila said one afternoon, handing Grace a file she'd corrected without being asked. "You should be running this place." Grace laughed it off, but Lila's words stuck, like a seed planted in cracked soil. What nobody saw was Grace at night, in her tiny apartment, poring over those photos of the documents, piecing together a puzzle that could bring Harrington Foods to its knees. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her mama's memory, for Sophie's future, for every person who'd been told they were nothing. But the weight of it all made her chest tight. Could she really take on a company like this? A man like Travis? She thought about walking away, disappearing into some other town. But then she'd hear Sophie's voice. "You're my star, Gracie." And she'd know she couldn't run, not this time. What she didn't expect was that Maggie and Lila were already in her corner, ready to help her light the match that would set everything ablaze.
At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute. Maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. The annual shareholders meeting at Harrington Foods was the kind of event that turned Willow Creek into a circus for a day. Pickup trucks and polished SUVs lined the streets, locals in flannel mixed with city suits, and the air buzzed with the weight of money and power. The town hall, with its high ceilings and creaky wooden floors, was packed to the brim, the hum of voices like a swarm of bees. Grace Thompson stood at the back, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest, clutching a USB drive that felt heavier than a brick. She was supposed to be there as support staff, thanks to Leila Monroe pulling some strings, but nobody in that room knew what she was about to unleash. Travis Boone, the CFO, strutted across the stage like a peacock, his PowerPoint slides flashing numbers that made the crowd ooh and ah. Record profits, new markets, the pride of Willow Creek. Elliot Harrington sat at the head table, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the room like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Grace caught his glance for a split second, and she wondered if he was thinking about that night he'd caught her on the floor with Sophie, singing her to sleep. She pushed the thought away. This wasn't about him. Not yet. Grace had spent weeks piecing together the truth from those basement documents, her mama's death staring back at her in black and white lies. She'd always thought she'd keep her head down, survive, and move on. But the weight of Ruth Thompson's name on that report, labeled a suicide when Grace knew it was a cover-up for a faulty machine, had lit a fire she couldn't put out. When the floor opened for questions, Grace felt her legs move before her brain caught up. She stepped to the microphone, her maid's uniform swapped for a simple gray dress she'd bought at a thrift store, the locket with her mama's photo tucked under her collar. The room went quiet, like someone had sucked the air out of it. Travis's smirk faltered, just for a second as he recognized her. "I have a question," Grace said, her voice steady, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Why did Harrington Foods cover up my mother's death? And why did you, Mr. Boone, steal my business plan to build your empire?" The crowd gasped, a low rumble spreading like wildfire. Grace plugged the USB into the projector, and the screen lit up with scanned documents, fake invoices, hidden payouts, and a safety report that detailed how Ruth Thompson died when a machine malfunctioned at the factory. Grace's voice didn't waver as she pointed to the screen.
My mother, Ruth Thompson, worked herself to the bone for this company. She begged for better equipment, but you ignored her. When she died, you called it a suicide to save your own skin. She clicked to the next slide, her old business plan from when she was an 18-year-old intern, the one that launched Harrington's best-selling organic line. And this was mine. I wrote it, poured my heart into it, and you, Travis, took it, pushed me out, and built your career on my work. The room erupted in whispers, heads turning, cameras flashing. Travis's face went white as a sheet, his hands gripping the podium like he might collapse. "This is outrageous," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She's a liar, a nobody, just a maid."
At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute. Maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. Elliot stood up, his chairs scraping against the floor. "Enough, Travis," he said, his voice low but hard as steel. He turned to Grace, his eyes wide, like he was seeing her for the first time. "Ruth Thompson? I remember her. She worked for my grandfather. She was kind to me when I was a kid." His voice broke, and Grace saw something flicker in his face. Guilt, maybe, or shame. She didn't care. She wasn't done. "This isn't just about my mother," she said, turning to the crowd. "It's about every worker in that factory who's been silenced, every person in this town who's been told they're nothing because they don't wear a suit or live in a big house. I'm here for them." The room exploded in applause, shareholders and townsfolk alike, their cheers drowning out Travis's protests. Reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras trained on Grace like she was the only person in the world. Travis lunged toward the projector, trying to yank the USB out, but Lila Monroe, quick as a cat, blocked his path. "Sit down, Travis," she said, her voice dripping with defiance. Maggie Cole, standing near the door, gave Grace a nod, her eyes shining with pride. Grace felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something new, power. She'd spent years swallowing her pain, keeping her head down, but in that moment, she was a force, unstoppable. "You think you've won?" Travis hissed, his face twisted with rage as security escorted him off the stage. "This isn't over." But his words were hollow, like a dog barking at a storm it couldn't stop. The crowd was on Grace's side now, and she could feel it, the shift, the moment when the invisible became seen. Travis approached her as the room began to clear, his tie loosened, his face a mix of shock and something softer, something Grace couldn't quite name. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About your mother, about any of this. I was wrong about you, Grace, so wrong." She looked at him, her eyes steady but burning. "Words don't fix what's broken, Mr. Harrington," she said. "Actions do." She turned away, leaving him standing there, his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who just realized the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. What nobody in that room knew was that Grace had one more card to play, a letter her mama had written to Elliot's grandfather, tucked inside that locket, promising to expose the company's secrets if they didn't make things right. Grace hadn't decided whether to use it yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just fighting for her mama anymore. She was fighting for Sophie, for Lila, for Maggie, for every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. What Grace didn't expect was the way the town hall felt different as she walked out, less like a cage and more like a stage. The reporters swarmed her, asking for quotes, but she just smiled and said, "Talk to the workers. They're the real story." Lila caught up with her outside, grabbing her hand. "You were incredible," she said, her eyes bright. "You just changed everything." Grace shook her head, her throat tight. "Not yet," she said, "but we're getting there." As she walked back to her apartment under the Willow Creek stars, the locket heavy against her chest, she felt her mama's strength in her bones. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in years, Grace didn't feel like she was carrying it alone.
at a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute. Maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. The fallout from Grace Thompson's bombshell at the Harrington Foods shareholders meeting hit Willow Creek like a summer storm, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. Travis Boone was out, fired on the spot, his office cleared before the sun set. The local paper ran a front-page story with a grainy photo of him being escorted out, his face twisted like he'd bitten into something sour. But Travis wasn't the type to go quietly. From his fancy condo on the edge of town, he started whispering poison to the press, spinning a tale that Grace was a schemer, cozying up to Elliot Harrington for power and money. "She's playing the victim card," he told a sleazy tabloid, his words dripping with venom. "A maid doesn't just waltz into a boardroom unless she's got an angle." The rumors spread like wildfire through Willow Creek's diners and church pews, and Grace felt the sting of every sideways glance as she walked to the market. She'd always thought she could handle the whispers, she'd heard worse growing up, but these hit different, like a knife twisting in an old wound. Still, she kept her head high, her mama's locket warm against her chest, reminding her of the fight she'd started for Ruth, for Sophie, for herself. Elliot Harrington called an emergency staff meeting the next morning, the air in the Harrington Foods conference room thick with tension. Grace stood at the back, her arms crossed, expecting another round of cold shoulders. Instead, Elliot stepped to the podium, his tie loose, his eyes heavy with something that looked like regret. "I owe Grace Thompson an apology," he said, his voice steady but raw. "I judged her, dismissed her, and I was dead wrong. She's not just the best of us, she's the future of this company." The room went quiet, a few gasps breaking the silence. Grace's heart thudded, caught off guard by his words. He wasn't done. "I'm offering Grace the role of Director of Community Strategy, effective immediately. She's shown us what courage looks like, and we need her to rebuild what we've broken." The staff erupted in applause, some genuine, some hesitant, but Grace felt the weight of their eyes, some warm, some wary. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "I'll take the job, Mr. Harrington, but on one condition. This company puts people before profits. No more cover-ups, no more lies." Elliot nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "Deal," he said. And for the first time, Grace saw something in him that wasn't arrogance, hope maybe, or a man trying to claw his way back to being human. Travis's rumors didn't stand a chance. Lila Monroe, the scrappy young admin who'd become Grace's right hand, dug up an old voicemail Travis had left her, bragging about handling the factory accident cover-up. She leaked it to the press, and by noon, the tabloid story flipped. Travis was the villain now, his name mud in Willow Creek. Grace watched the news break from her new office, a small room with a window overlooking the factory. Lila burst in, grinning like she'd won the lottery. "We got him, Grace. He's done." Grace shook her head, her lips tight. "It's not about him. It's about making sure no one else gets hurt." Lila nodded, her eyes shining with something like awe. Maggie Cole, the housekeeper who'd been Grace's quiet champion, stopped by later with a thermos of coffee and a rare smile. "You're doing what your mama would have done," she said, her voice thick. She'd be proud. Grace's throat tightened, and she clutched the locket, feeling Ruth's strength in her bones. She hadn't expected Maggie to see her like that, like she was carrying a legacy bigger than herself.
At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute, maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. Grace poured her heart into her new role, launching Sunlit Path, a nonprofit to support the town's working moms and kids, inspired by those nights she'd slept on the floor to comfort Sophie. The name came from a memory of her mama, who'd always said, "Find the path where the sun shines, Gracie, even when it's dark." The organization started small, job training, childcare grants, but it was a spark, and Grace knew sparks could start fires. One evening, she was reading Sophie a bedtime story, the little girl curled up against her, her tiny hand clutching Grace's sleeve. "Are you mommy now?" Sophie asked, her voice soft as a whisper. Grace froze, her heart swelling until it hurt. She brushed a curl from Sophie's face, her eyes stinging. "I'm your Gracie," she said, her voice cracking, "and I'm not going anywhere." Elliot stood in the doorway, watching them, his usual sharp edges softened. "She's right, you know," he said, stepping closer. "You're family, Grace. You've been family since the moment you stayed for her." Grace looked at him, searching his face for the man who'd called her a lowlife. He wasn't there anymore. Instead, she saw a father, a man wrestling with his own failures, trying to build something new. "Family's earned, Elliot," she said quietly. "You're getting there." He smiled, a real one, and for a moment the big house on Maple Street didn't feel so cold. Willow Creek started to change, slowly but surely. Factory workers, inspired by Grace's stand, pushed for better conditions. Lila got a promotion, her confidence blooming under Grace's mentorship. Maggie, nearing retirement, started volunteering at Sunlit Path, teaching cooking classes to single moms. But the real shift came one quiet afternoon when Grace found a letter tucked in her mama's locket, one she'd never noticed before. It was from Ruth to Elliot's grandfather, written days before her death. "If you don't fix this factory, I'll tell the world what you've done." Grace's hand shook as she read it, realizing her mama had been a fighter too. She didn't show Elliot the letter, not yet. It was her insurance, her proof that the past wasn't done with her. What she didn't expect was the way Elliot started showing up, not just at work, but at Sunlit Path meetings, carrying Sophie on his shoulders, listening to the women Grace was helping. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that was more than Grace had ever thought possible. As she locked her office that night, the factory lights glowing across the street, she felt something she hadn't in years: peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from knowing you're building something that lasts. The Willow Creek Community Center was buzzing on a crisp autumn evening, its parking lot packed with rusty pickups and family minivans, the kind of scene that made you feel like the whole town had shown up for a Friday night football game. But this wasn't about touchdowns. It was about Grace Thompson, standing on a makeshift stage under string lights, facing a crowd of farmers, factory workers, and even a few Harrington food suits. Her gray thrift store dress had been swapped for a simple blazer, but her mama's locket still hung close to her heart, a quiet reminder of where she'd come from. The air smelled of apple cider and hope, and as Grace gripped the microphone, her voice carried a weight that made the crowd lean in. "I used to think I didn't belong here," she said, her words clear and steady, like she was talking to an old friend over coffee. "I was told I was just the help, a nobody who should keep her head down. But I learned something. Your worth isn't what they call you, it's what you fight for." The crowd hung on every word, some nodding, some wiping tears, their faces lit by the glow of a woman who turned pain into power. Grace's journey from maid to director of community strategy at Harrington Foods had shaken Willow Creek to its core. Her nonprofit, Sunlit Path, was growing fast, offering job training, childcare, and a safe space for women who'd been told they were invisible. Tonight, she was launching its first big fundraiser, but it wasn't just about money. It was about telling the world that people like her mama, Ruth Thompson, deserved to be remembered. "My mama fought for better days," Grace said, her voice catching as she held up the locket. "She wrote a letter to the Harringtons, begging them to fix the factory that took her life. They ignored her, but I'm here to finish what she started." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "This isn't about revenge. It's about building a world where no one gets left behind." The crowd erupted, clapping and cheering, their voices echoing off the community center's tin roof. Grace's eyes found Janice Reed in the front row, a former factory worker who'd been fired years ago for questioning safety standards.
Grace had tracked her down, offered her a job as a sunlit path advisor, and tonight Janice sat tall, her smile saying she'd finally found her place again. Grace hadn't expected to see Janice cry, but those tears felt like a victory, a sign that justice wasn't just a word, it was real. Elliot Harrington stood off to the side, Sophie perched on his shoulders, her little hands waving a glow stick. He wasn't the same man who'd called Grace a lowlife months ago. His eyes followed her now, not with arrogance, but with something deeper, respect, maybe even love. After the speech, he found her by the cider table, Sophie tugging at Grace's hand. "You were amazing up there," Elliot said, his voice soft, like he was afraid to break the moment. "You've changed this town, Grace. You've changed me." Grace looked at him, searching for the man who'd once pushed her away. He wasn't there anymore. "I didn't do it alone," she said, ruffling Sophie's curls. "You and this little one gave me a reason to keep going." Sophie giggled, wrapping her arms around Grace's legs. "You're my Gracie," she said, and Grace's heart swelled, the kind of ache that comes from finding a home you never thought you'd have. Elliot hesitated, then reached for her hand. "I want to be part of this, Grace, not just the company, but us, you, me, Sophie." Grace didn't answer right away, but her fingers squeezed his, a quiet promise that they'd figure it out, one step at a time. Willow Creek was different now. Harrington Foods had new safety protocols, pushed by workers inspired by Grace's courage. Leela Monroe, now a junior manager, was running Sunlit Path's job program, her confidence a spark Grace had helped ignite. Maggie Cole, retired but restless, was teaching pie-making classes at the community center, her laughter filling the rooms she'd once cleaned. The factory lights glowed brighter these days, not just with electricity, but with a sense that things could be better. Grace had found another letter from her mama, tucked in an old recipe book Maggie gave her. A note Ruth had written to herself. "Keep fighting, even when it hurts. The sun always rises." Grace carried those words like a shield, using them to guide Sunlit Path as it grew, reaching women in neighboring towns, giving them a chance to stand tall. What she didn't expect was the way Elliot showed up, not just with donations, but with time, helping at fundraisers, listening to the women's stories, becoming a man Sophie could be proud of. One night, as they walked through Willow Creek's park, Sophie skipping ahead, Elliot turned to Grace. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice rough, "but I'm trying to." Grace smiled, the stars above them bright as her mama's memory. "Keep trying, Elliot," she said. "We've got time." At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute, maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. Grace left a letter for Sophie, tucked in her favorite storybook for when she was older. "You taught me family isn't just blood. It's the people who stay, who fight for you. I love you, always." As she stood outside the Sunlit Path office, watching women line up for classes, their faces full of hope, Grace felt something settle in her soul. She wasn't the maid sleeping on the floor anymore. She was a light, a path, a promise that no one in Willow Creek would be forgotten again. The town wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward, and Grace knew she'd keep pushing, for her mama, for Sophie, for every underdog who needed a chance to shine. The story of Grace Thompson and Willow Creek teaches us that our worth isn't defined by the labels others pin on us, made, lowlife, invisible, but by the courage we muster to stand up and speak out. It's a reminder that injustice thrives in silence, but one voice, rooted in truth and love, can spark a fire that changes everything. Grace faced a world that tried to dim her light, yet she found strength in her mother's legacy, in a child's trust, and in her own unyielding spirit. This resonates deeply, especially for those who felt overlooked or judged, whether by race, class, or circumstance. Like the American saying goes, you can't judge a book by its cover. And Grace's journey shows us to look beyond appearances, to challenge toxic biases, and to value the heart over the hierarchy. For those of us carrying the weight of tradition or expectation, her story urges self-reflection. Are we silencing ourselves or others? Are we building bridges or walls? The path to fairness starts with recognizing everyone's humanity, including our own, and daring to fight for it, even when it hurts. So, what did Grace's story stir in you? Share your thoughts or your own stories of overcoming prejudice in the comments. We'd love to hear them. Hit that like button if this moved you, and subscribe to catch more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. Here's to finding peace after the storm and to carrying hope forward wherever your path leads.